Good morning, everybody. I wanted to go through chapter 1 a little bit quickly, just because it's just the intro, and we will definitely get to this stuff later on in this semester. So excuse me if I skip through some of the things. I'm just going to try and hit the most important points. So in this chapter, we'll definitely talk a little bit about, what is developmental psychology or lifespan psychology, human growth and development. There's lots of different names for this class. We'll talk a little bit about the different theories. And of course, as with any psychology class, we're going to talk about the research methods that we use. So a developmental psychologist is somebody that either does research or practices, and they focus on the human lifespan. We follow the individual from what we say the womb to the tomb, so from conception all the way through death, and we look at how they develop cognitively, physically, and socially, okay? Or sometimes we would say social, emotional development. So lifespan development, the definition, scientific study of human growth throughout life. And here are some examples of things that people might do. Gerontology is the study of elderly people. It could be anything from studying that elderly life, like the social aspect of it. They could look at the physical decline and how people adapt to that decline in their capabilities, or what we like to say, like their activities of daily living. You could look at cognition. How is their memory doing? And then all the way into maybe the death and the dying process. Child development, I think, goes without any explanation, and adult development could be things like social aspect, marriage, becoming parents, the career, and handling some of the hardships that come with adulthood, like taking care of their elderly parents, job loss, divorce, terminal illness, things like that. We definitely would focus on a multidisciplinary approach. This is, you're going to find this in any psychology class. We'll look at again, like the physical development. We would look at the biological aspects of that, the social aspects of that, cognitive, cultural, so on. So all of these different perspectives in psychology will help us understand somebody's development. Okay. Of course, there's always individual differences. And we'll look at predictable developmental milestones, things that we know people should pass through. And that kind of leads into this last one down here about normative and non-normative transitions. So a non-normative transition is something that not everybody in the human world experiences. Normative is that all people in the species would experience it. So for the most part, everybody goes through puberty, everybody goes through the death process. So those would be normative transitions. Things that would be non-normative transitions are, of course, things like any traumatic event that might happen to you. Not everybody experiences that. Not every child experiences the death of a parent, abuse, things like that. So those are kind of events that can happen to a person that would certainly affect their development, but not everybody passes through that. So this is a little bit of what we call like the context of development. These are influences, if you want to think of it that way. These are very important aspects of how a person will develop. So a cohort is everybody that you're born with. We can certainly think of them as like generations. We have our boomers, we have our millennials, our Gen X, our Gen Z, and so on. So those are what we would call a cohort. Obviously, the time at which you are born is going to affect your development, right? The kids growing up right now are super, super tech savvy. They are going to know everything there is to know about computers, especially when you compare that to, say, our baby boomers, right? So we can see here, obviously, a cohort is going to influence your development. Socioeconomic status is, it's a combination of education and income. It's based on the main concept that the higher the education, the higher the income. Of course, does that always equal out? No, right? We have some people who have little education and they make a lot of money. And then we have some people who have a lot of education and they make very little money. So of course, there are individual differences to that, but for the most part, you can assume high SES is, highly educated, high income, okay? And so, of course, we can see that our socioeconomic status is going to influence our development. These next two just kind of go without saying, right? Of course, culture and ethnicity and your gender is going to influence your development. And we will definitely look at all of these factors as we go through this course. So just a little bit about, this is talking about the impact of a cohort. Like if we were looking at the baby boomers compared to now, children, how they were treated way, even prior to the baby boomers, children were not treated very kindly. They were kind of seen as little dumb adults. They didn't want to, adults would always say things like, children are to be seen and not heard. They thought children had nothing valuable to offer the world. Beatings were high, child mistreatment was high. If you survived, you were sent to work. If you had money and you survived, you were sent to boarding school. So, the treatment of children was pretty sad, I think is the best way to put that. With the Enlightenment, people started saying, call me crazy, but maybe children are still learning and maybe they're not just dumb adults. And maybe if we treat them kindly and we teach them and we show them things, then they'll grow up to be these nice, educated, contributing members of society. And so we really started to see that happen. And France was one of the first countries that instituted elementary school. And so then, shortly thereafter, all the other countries kind of followed suit, and you had kids going to school, and it just kind of changed the view of children, and people started treating them a lot nicer. They kind of saw them as a special, they're special, they're sweet, they're learning. We have to take care of them, and it created how we now think of children. Okay. And then, for a long time, you got out of school around 8th grade or so, and you were just done, and you were considered an adult. So, you guys are pretty young, but your great grandparents, I would say, probably started having children around, 14, 15, years of age, and that was normal. Now that didn't, well, we don't have that too much. It depends, of course, but but now it's expected, or you have to go to high school. You can't get out for the most part until you're about 18. And we didn't see that until like 1930s. With the Great Depression, we had way too many people searching for jobs. And so Roosevelt signed into bill that kids would go to high school. It would give a chance for the older people in the population to find work, and it kept these younger teens in school, and they became more educated and got more skills. And it was just a way to kind of like alleviate the economy during the Great Depression. But I think they say like by 1935, you had, a vast majority of teenagers in school. And so that was interesting in and of itself, because you had these individuals who, quote unquote, like a year ago were considered adults, and now they're forced to be in school again. And so it created this group of people that Stanley Hall was the person who coined the term adolescence. And so now we have these adolescents, or what we now call teenagers, and it again forced people to see this as a special time, as individuals that needed to be taken care of and protected, and so on. So now we have these two age groups, childhood and adolescence, that have been created through history because of school. And now we have this happening again in real time. We're living through it. We have this other group of individuals that are being created called emerging adults. And that is probably you guys. It's, after high school, but it's still about 25, 26 years of age, where you can't necessarily go out into society and just be this fully, functioning, self-independent adult, because we require college now, right? It's not mandatory. It's not going to be signed into bill like we had high school, but you could say that socially, economically, it's pretty much demanded, expected of you to go to college. And so what does that do? Well, that creates, again, another group of individuals who are kind of protected. We have to take care, parents have to kind of take care of the kids. They probably live at home, because anybody who's out there going to college and paying for it on your own and trying to work and trying to live on your own is very, very difficult. Okay, so emerging adulthood is a new life stage that we are in the midst of it being created. A little bit about our older years. This is another age that's, or a time of life that is changing, because people live so long now. A long time ago, we died in our 40s, or certainly by our 50s. And now it is, not uncommon to live well into our 80s, our 90s. And in fact, people over the age of 100, that is the fastest growing group of people. So we, just live for a really long time now. And we can thank that to the advances of medicine and medical technology. We can give you medicines for everything. We can, keep you alive. We can give you a new heart. We can, all of these different things that can be done to prolong life. And with that, we now have two new stages of our elderly people. We have our young old, which is like 60s and 70s. And then we have, I don't like this word, but we have our old, which is 80s and beyond. This is just a little bit about our life expectancy for women and men. This data, 2013, that is a long time ago. In fact, our life expectancy in the United States has dropped. It dropped a few years ago because of the opioid pandemic, and now it has dropped, of course, because of the COVID pandemic. But it hasn't dropped that much. It's a year or so. But anyways, this is showing something that I think is interesting to note. for the most part, across the board, females live longer than males. And we say, it's about a 4-year average that females will outlive men. And, in Japan, Israel, and Spain, they're really doing things well there. They live the longest. The United States is close, right? And these are all your more wealthy nations. If you start looking at nations that are still developing or very, very poor, you can see that their life expectancy is not as long. This is just a little breakdown of what we can see the United States doing as far as ethnic groups. Compared, 2013 to projections of 2042, whites will drop, and in terms of their numbers and their percentages. Our fastest growing group of individuals are Hispanic and Latino, and so on. So that's just a little bit of the makeup of the United States. I'm not sure why they put that in here, but they did. All right, so now a little bit into some of the theories and how we look at development. So, obviously a theory is an attempt to explain behavior or predict behavior. The nature-nurture question, I'm not going to talk too much about this. This is just, whether it's what you're born with, your nature, your biology, or is it nurture? Is it your environment and your learning and your social aspect? Obviously, it's both, right? And so we no longer pit those two against each other. We now say it's both, right? I can't take out my nature, and I certainly can't take out my nurture. So both of those aspects influence who we are. Hardcore nurture people, Watson and Skinner, they are behaviorists in psychology. And so they say it's all about our environment. I'm not going to talk about them. We just don't really need to. Self-efficacy is something that will come up in a little bit with children, and it really is an important aspect to development. And it's important for people to grow up and feel effective. So this is, how well do you feel that you can control your environment, that you can control things that happen to you, and, how competent you feel. Okay, so this is an important aspect, and we will talk about this a little bit later. You could argue that a high self-efficacy can lead to or be closely tied with a high self-esteem. Okay, if you feel competent, then likely you will feel good about yourself. Oh, well, okay. I was like, I'm not going to talk about Freud. We'll talk a little bit about Freud right here. If you're not a psychology major, it's important for you to know that Freud is not everything and all things psychology. He's not. He is a big, influencer, of course, but he's not as prominent as maybe people are led to believe. This is the only time we will talk about Freud in this class. So Freud was an interesting individual. He studied very mentally disturbed people, and that is what he based his entire theory on. And he tried to apply that theory to everybody. So when we go through this, you'll see it's a little bit bizarre. It's a little bit strange. So bear with me here, okay? Freud is important for personality. He says that our personality is shaped in childhood, and he pretty much blames everything on the mom. So he says that we pass through stages, and that stage is defined by our what he calls our id, which is a pleasure principle. It's a kind of like the devil on your shoulder, if you want to think of it like that. It's satisfaction. So he says that a baby, an infant, is going to be focused on the mouth, and that it wants to satisfy the mouth. So that would be things like sucking, biting, chewing. And if you look at a baby, that's what they do, right? They suck on things, they stick everything in their mouth, they chew on things, they kind of explore the world through figuring out whether something tastes good or not. And that's totally normal. So that's the oral stage. Most people can kind of handle that and feel okay with it. The 1 to 3 years is what he calls the anal stage. So he says that the id is focused on the bowels and being able to control going to the restroom. 1 to 3 years of age obviously is a time where we potty train children. And, they go through a time where they're trying to figure out whether they can hold it or they can go to the bathroom and so on. Again, this one, I guess, kind of makes sense. The 3 to 6 years of age, this is what we call the phallic stage, or well, not we, Freud called it the phallic stage. He says that this is a time of life that children are focused on their genitals. And that pleasure is derived from, touching their genitals. If you've ever been around a 3 to 6 year old, even younger than that, it's true. They will grab themselves. They might touch themselves. I mean, it's totally normal. The weird thing about it is that Freud did put a sexual component to it. And, I think if you've been around children that age, they're not touching their genitals because of a sexual, I don't know, drive. They're doing it more like as if you itch a mosquito bite, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, that felt good. And they don't have the same mindset as an adult who sees it through the lens of that's a sexual thing. Children come about it in a very natural way, in an innocent way, where they're just like, I don't know, that feels good. And they don't understand the sex side of it. But that's my opinion. The latency stage, he says nothing is really happening during this stage. And then adolescence and above, the focus is on, once again, on the genitals, and that children, are at this age kind of, physically mature, and they've got to deal with all their own sexual gratification at that point. Now, how this is tied to our personality is, he says that if we pass through these stages correctly, then we develop normally. If we don't pass through these stages correctly, we can become fixated, and that can guide and influence our personality. So let's say somebody is stuck in the oral stage, and how you get stuck is really anybody's guess. And Freud was conveniently the only person who could tell you how you got stuck, but it was all pretty much your mom. Your mom either bottle fed you and you wanted to be breastfed, or you were breastfed and you didn't like that and you wanted to be bottle fed, or they took away the bottle too soon, or your mom stopped breastfeeding you too soon. They gave you a pacifier, or they didn't give you a pacifier. So you can see it can go on and on and on. I mean, it just, who knows what caused it. But if you have an oral fixation, he says that those are people who smoke, those are people who bite their nails, chew their pens, and maybe even like are the type of people that snap at people. You might bite somebody's head off if they irritate you or something like that. So that would be an oral fixation. An anal fixation is not probably what you're thinking, but it's being very, very picky. It's being very, very clean. If you call somebody, oh, they're so anal, that usually means that they're a perfectionist, right? They have to have it exactly right. And he says that this could happen because your mom didn't potty train you correctly. Maybe she focused too much on cleanliness. Maybe she got mad at you if you wet the bed or something like that. So these, I don't know, there's no way to go back and test them. There's no way to prove or disprove his theories. They're kind of like, it's just a nice thing to read and maybe laugh about. The phallic stage, this is one of the most interesting ones. Well, interesting and weird. The phallic stage is where Freud came up with the Oedipus complex. And he says at this stage, little boys want to sleep with their mom and they see their dad as a rival. And so they either want to kill their dad and get rid of him so they can be with their mom, or they pass through this stage correctly where they realize, oh, that's silly, I can't be with my mom, and I love my dad, and they grow up normal, I guess. We also have what we call the Electra complex, and the same thing with little girls want to be with their dads, they want to get rid of their mom, and so on. Interestingly enough, this is where Freud's theory of homosexuality comes from. He says if you're stuck in the phallic stage, it's because you didn't pass through it correctly, and that's what causes homosexuality. So for example, I'll use myself. Let's say he says that I, as a child, wanted to sleep with my dad and I hated my mom and she was my rival. So if I got stuck in that stage, then I would continue to grow that way, that I would hate my mom. I would reject all things my mom, and I would be still like enamored with my dad, and I would take on his characteristics. I would follow him more, I guess, therefore, in theory, making me homosexual, that I would take on male or masculine characteristics and push away all things female like my mom. So, it's, I guess, an interesting theory. We certainly don't believe this happens. But if you wanted to look into that a little bit more, that's Freud. So you can see why I say that I think his stuff is a little bit strange. It's fun to read, I guess, for entertainment purposes. So here's just a few more people. We have Bowlby, we have Harlow, and we have Ainsworth. All of these people are going to come up, and we're going to talk about them when we talk about children, because they're very important with something that we call the attachment theory. I guess they're a little bit tied to Freud. Here it's saying Bowlby is definitely tied to Freud. They don't necessarily believe all the sex and aggression stuff that Freud did, but they do believe that your childhood experiences are going to shape you, and they're going to, definitely influence your personality. They did agree with Freud in that they believed the mom was crucial. So they either praised the mom that she did a great job, or they, condemned her because she was the one that messed you up. So we'll see that those all kind of that had a major influence on some of these theorists. I'm going to talk about that. Okay. This is just, a little bit again about nature and nurture. You can go through and read those. We really believe that nature and nurture work together. Okay. Erikson is another theorist. We will see Erikson throughout this semester. Like I said, we only talk about Freud that one time. We're going to move on from him, but Erikson we do follow, and another guy that we follow a lot is Piaget. Okay, so Erikson was interested in our social development. And so he had these, I want to say 8 stages, okay? And he really liked Freud also, so much so that you could say he kind of like plagiarized him. Freud had psychosexual stages. Erikson has psychosocial stages. Erickson also says that you can pass through the stages correctly, or you can have like a negative outcome to the stage, very similar to how Freud believed you could go through stages. So, however, if you look at these, though, we could say for the most part, they're pretty right on. They're pretty true, and you can see this happening in life. So he says that infancy is forced to resolve the task or the psychosocial task of gaining and learning trust, or they will be mistrustful. Okay, I'm not sure if that's a word, but so infancy, right? They need to learn trust. And this is going to come from usually the primary caregiver, which is usually the mom, right? So will the mom teach this baby that the baby can trust the mom? Is the mom there for it, to comfort it and take care of it? Okay. So trust versus mistrust. Toddlers, we have something that's called autonomy versus shame and doubt. So he says babies or toddlers should learn to be autonomous or independent. If you've ever been around a toddler, this is the stage where they want to do everything. They want to dress themselves, they want to tie their shoes, they want to pour the milk. And he says that this is the stage at which they're trying to be independent. If they don't pass through this correctly, that they can become shameful and doubtful. Okay. We have initiative. I'm going to do both of these together: initiative and guilt versus industry and inferiority. These are very closely related to each other. Initiative: does the child take initiative to try new things, or do they feel guilty that they can't try new things? Industry is, do they feel effective and that they can work towards a goal, they can work in a group and contribute, or do they feel inferior? Adolescents, he says their role or their task is identity. They've got to figure out who they are, or they're going to suffer from role confusion. Young adults need to figure out intimacy. They need to find somebody to be with, or they're going to suffer from isolation. Middle adulthood, generativity is giving back to the next generation or helping nurture a younger group of people, or they're going to suffer stagnation. They're going to feel stuck. They're going to feel like their life has no purpose. And then late adulthood, they should feel that they have integrity. They should be able to look back on their life and feel proud that it was a good life, or they're going to suffer from despair. So some of these things are right on. Some of them might be a little bit like, oh my gosh, it's like doomsday, right? Like, oh, I have no meaning in life and so on. But, we might be able to look at some individuals in our life or that we know, and maybe they are going through these things. So, it can be a little bit like very dark, I guess, like Freud. But we can also see that, there is some truth to this. So we'll talk about these stages throughout class. Here's our other guy. We've got Piaget. And I don't want to spend too much time here because I promise you we talk a lot about Piaget throughout this class. Some people call him the father of developmental psychology. And so he was interested in cognition, how babies or children begin to think about the world. And so he's really only focused on children because he says after about the age of 12 that you really are, thinking like an adult. You have your cognitive abilities are set in stone at that point. So he has only these 4 stages: our sensory motor, pre-operations, and then we have concrete and formal operations. Sensory motor is your infancy up to toddler stage, that the baby is learning about the world through senses and through movement, right? Sensory motor. Pre-operations, these are, and we'll go through all of these are your young kids. They are not thinking logically. They are not having reasonable thought processes. There's just really no logic in this stage. 8 to 12, they start to understand logic, they start to understand basic math principles, and they can reason about the world. And then 12 and on, they're thinking more abstractly, hypothetically. They can kind of think more about the world like in a scientific matter. All right, I'm gonna skip that stuff. So just real quick about what types of experiments we can do in developmental psychology. So an experiment is the only type of research where we can say this causes that. And I would say that that's in comparison to what we would call a correlational study. Correlation cannot infer causation. And with correlation, we can only use it to predict behavior, okay? So experiments, a true experiment is where you have at least two groups, right? You have an experimental group, and then you have a control. And one of the other most important things to an experiment is that you randomly assign participants to those two groups, okay? So you have to have those two things. You have to have at least two groups, and you have to have random assignment. And when you have those two aspects, we can call it a true experiment. And from that point, you can say this causes that, okay? So let's see, two types or research methods, I guess would be a better way to say that, are something that's called a longitudinal study and a cross-sectional study. So a longitudinal study has this root word here, long, and I think that's the best way to think about it. This is going to be a very long study. This takes individuals at a certain point in time and then follows those same individuals across their lifespan, or across a certain number of years. So if we wanted to see right now how these children growing up in the pandemic, how that will affect them in their later years, we would have to start capturing those children right now. We would identify our group, and then we would follow them and measure them at different given points, and then follow them all the way into their 60s or 70s so that we can see how the pandemic affected them. This type of research is not, I mean, it has its benefits and it has its disadvantages. Obviously, it's going to take a very long time, so that usually by the time that the research is concluded, the researcher, the original researcher, is probably already passed away. So it's also pretty costly. So sometimes this research isn't always conducted, but it gives us really great insight into how a certain cohort might handle certain events that happen throughout their life. Because longitudinal studies are so time consuming and so expensive, a lot of times you'll see things that are like cross-sectional studies. So this is where we might take out a section of the lifespan. Say we want to compare right now how children are handling the pandemic compared to elderly adults. So we would just look at children, and then we'd have a group of elderly adults. And this study, you know, obviously isn't going to take too much time. It just gives you a snapshot, and that's how that is. So cross-sectional, you just take out like a section of the lifespan. Longitudinal, you study that same group across the lifespan. These are different ways that you can collect data. Naturalistic observation is where you watch individuals in their natural setting. Usually this is done with children because children kind of act weird when you sit them down and start asking them questions. So you might get a better gauge if you just go and watch a child in their classroom or out on the playground or something like that. A self-report is an observer report. These are both. So it's like a self-report is like a questionnaire, right? A survey that I would give you and ask you questions or so on. And then an observer report is maybe we ask the teacher to report on the child, or we ask the parent to report on the child. Always, 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 when you're reading a study, when you're looking at something in the news or in an article, always consider the participants. Who are they? Who are they measuring? Why did they measure it? How did they measure it? Try and consider other explanations for the outcomes, especially if it's a correlational study. And here it says, respect longitudinal studies, but also remember who the participants are. So sometimes when we get research, they're like, so-and-so's not doing very well with computers, and it's like, well, are we talking about baby boomers? Are we talking about millennials? Or are we talking about our Gen Z, right? So that's going to be a totally different outcome based on that cohort. And that is it for chapter 1. Thanks, guys.